Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos, a todas. En primer lugar, gracias por sumarse a participar de esta actividad. Les doy la bienvenida al seminario en línea llamado El Nuevo No Alineamiento y la Nueva Guerra Fría, organizado por la campaña Basta de Guerra Fría, pero también por el Instituto Tricontinental de Investigación Social, por la red de ALBA Movimientos, por la red de Panafricanismo Today, y la Asamblea Internacional de los Pueblos. Quiero aprovechar esta ocasión para agradecer.
I want to take the opportunity to thank all the co-sponsors and organizers of this activity. My name is Nada Sarnadas. I'm a member of the campaign No Cold War, and together with Prashad, we're going to be moderating this activity today. But first of all, I'd like to try to tell you more about this platform and what is the No Cold War campaign. So I think it is important for me to share that the world order inherited from the World War II is floundering. And together with the powers of the global south, we are redefining the new context that we live today. There is a special place for China in this composition because it is the first time in over 140 years that an economy could be bigger than the U.S. economy, which represents, of course, a threat to the U.S. If we consider in terms of PPP, this has already happened since 2013. The China economy is bigger than that of the U.S., but it's not only about the GDP, but China is also recognized as a socialist country, different from the Western powers, wants to improve the conditions of the people, and doing this in a peaceful way, which represents a threat to this hegemony led by the United States of America that can't come up with solutions for the problems that the humanity has today. That's why we see that the sanctions imposed by the United States against China actually are worse and worse. And actually, we can see very clear that the main goal of the United States of America in the latest G7 summit is to have their allies unite against China. The Western powers today live in a Cold War mentality, and this is not good for anyone. This is not good for anyone in the world, and for a world that is hit still by the COVID-19 pandemic, where inequality and poverty is greater and greater. That's why we created this space and this No Cold War campaign, so that we can promote another kind of ideas. So we believe that any attempt of a new Cold War is against the interests of humanity, and we are in favor of cooperation to face up to the challenges that we have today. That's why we invite you to check our website, which is nocoldwar.org, and then you sign up to this campaign, to this idea, to these debates. We need cooperation, as we said, for this campaign. We need a dialogue and not a new Cold War and more sanctions, which is the mentality driven by the Western power. So after introducing this campaign, I'll turn it over to Vijay Prashad to tell us more about the concepts of a new Cold War and non-alignment. Over to you, Vijay.
Thanks a lot, Gisela. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Vijay Prashad. I'm the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and a member of the No Cold War team. For about a decade now, the United States has led a major policy shift in the world. Anxious about its declining stature in the world, Washington and its allies, Europe and Japan, have worried in particular about the emergence of China as a major world economy and the role of Russia, mainly for its energy supplies to Europe. To curtail the importance of China and to a lesser extent Russia, the West began a tactic of using all means necessary, including trade wars, information wars, and the buildup of a massive military in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. This buildup is known as the New Cold War. Due to the fragility of US power and the International Monetary Fund imposed debt austerity cycle on the global South, we have seen a sense of bewilderment grow from Southeast Asia to South America. No longer is there confidence, even amongst the neoliberals in the global South, that the United States and its allies, namely the Triad, offered a path for world stability or for the advancement of the goals of the peoples of the South. We see a new mood grow from Mexico to India, where these countries are simply no longer willing to be bullied about on the world stage. This new mood is called the new non-alignment. These developments have been accelerated by the war in Ukraine. Just yesterday, Russia's President Vladimir Putin was in the United Arab Emirates, generally a bunch of Emirati states which are pliant towards the United States. However, there was no attempt by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan to arrest Putin on the International Criminal Court warrant. Instead, the Sheikh said, "Mr. President, many threats are coming our way, especially given Russia's situation today. But we made up our minds and made a move, regardless of the conditions set by the West." This statement by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed encapsulates both the new Cold War, namely conditions set by the West, and the new non-alignment, namely we have made up our minds. This webinar seeks to explore these two concepts. We're going to have 4 speakers. They're going to speak sequentially. I'll introduce the first 2 speakers, and then Gisela will come back and introduce the last 2 speakers, after which we'll see if we have time for some discussion. We really hope that you get involved in this campaign against this new Cold War. Just to reaffirm what Gisela said, please go to our website, nocoldwar.org. We're very pleased to have as our first speaker today, Sevim Dagdelen, who is a member of the Bundestag, which is the German parliament. In the Bundestag, she is the deputy leader of the Die Linke group, that is the left party. She is an outspoken leader in Germany and in Europe for a path to peace. Sevim, welcome to No Cold War.
Thank you, Vijay. Thanks to the friends organizing this very important event. We are currently witnessing, since you said, a tectonic shift in international relations. And what we are talking about here is the erosion of some 500 years of Western hegemony and the end of the unipolar moment of the US empire that has prevailed since the collapse of the Soviet Union end of 19th, a development that has been greatly speeded up in recent times by NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. The end of the unipolar world under US hegemony is the beginning of the multipolar world. And it's very remarkable that even the German government has, for the first time in history, acknowledged the reality of a multipolar world in its new national security strategy, which was published a few days ago on Wednesday, last Wednesday. And we discussed this national security strategy in the plenary of the German parliament just yesterday. A development such as this can evidently no longer be denied. After all, the BRICS countries, for example, have already overtaken the G7 nations with a share of 31.5% of the world's economic output. And from its correct analysis, however, the German government unfortunately draws the completely wrong conclusions. Instead of offering a convincing answer to the question as to how Germany and Europe could and should position themselves in this new multipolar world, the security strategy is in the old vein of the West's quest for hegemony. Underpinned by the Fukuyama syndrome, the belief in one's own systemic predominance, the strategy is bent on confrontation, interventions, rearmament, and deterrence. And why am I telling you this? Because this strategy paper of the German government is paradigmatic of Europe's failure to get on the right side of history and pursue an independent, sovereign policy based on multilateralism. The highest ranking officer in the United States Armed Forces, Chief of Staff Mark Milley, recently spoke publicly once again about a multipolar international environment in which the USA, as well as China and Russia, are the most important powers in the world. He just did it recently in May. And if we look at Europe's positioning in this multipolar environment, it becomes apparent that the main obstacle on the path towards a constructive role for Europe in such a multipolar world is the lack of sovereignty from the hegemonic ambitions of the United States. And this manifests itself with shocking clarity in the complete subordination to the US strategy in the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. With respect to the US confrontation with China, there is, at any rate, still a degree of indecisiveness in the German government and within Europe. There is a debate within the German government, as is also being demonstrated by the discussions surrounding the national security strategy, regarding the extent to which we should submit to the US approach of decoupling, knowing full that if this happens, this would be a disaster for the German industry and meanwhile for millions of employers in Germany. At the end of the day, we are already getting a foretaste of such a scenario in the form of the brutal impacts of the West's proxy war and economic war against Russia. In addition to the countries of the global South, which are suffering immensely from skyrocketing food and energy prices, the main burden for the impacts of the sanctions policy is being borne primarily by the populations of Europe, which have been battered by inflation and real wage losses, above all United Kingdom and Germany, whose economies have entered a recession in the course of this economic war. In Germany, for example, workers suffered a real wage loss of over 4% last year. This is the biggest decline since the end of Second World War 1945. The threat of deindustrialization, including the loss of millions of jobs, is real, and the likelihood of this increasing as the trade war with China escalates. The 22% drop in China's investment in Europe last year shows the direction in which economic relations with Germany's most important trading partner are threatening to go. In numerous discussions, representatives from the countries of the global South asked me in amazement the following question time and again: how can it be that Germany and Europe are pursuing policies that are so fundamentally at odds with their own national interests? I tell them that Europe's political self-sacrifice is the product of the actions of a comprador bourgeoisie that's similar to Latin America in the 1970s, is devoted to implementing the interests of US corporations, and geopolitical dictates from Washington. The reason for this extreme subservience to US foreign policy is certainly not only the transatlantic networks in politics, in media and business that seek to recruit the necessary personnel and dominate the discourse here, or stationing of more than 38,000 US soldiers, as well as US nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, with an amount of 20 bombs in Germany. What is undoubtedly also of a paramount importance is the concentration of economic power on the part of US corporations and the resulting influence over political decisions. The US investment fund BlackRock should be mentioned at this point, which holds shares worth 59 billion euros in all 30 DAX, the German stock exchange, listed companies that makes up the German share index and is the largest single shareholder in 8 of these 30 German stock exchange companies. So the German government disregards for the interest of its own population is overlaid by a hyper-moralism that is difficult to outdo in terms of hubris and which has made double standards the order of the day. The neo-colonial arrogance expressed in the policy and increasingly coming back to haunt Western governments in the age of the emancipation of the global South and the self-confident pursuit of national interests by the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is particularly evident in the refusal of the countries of the global South to submit to the West's economic war against Russia, for example. And in the Western public sphere, the aim is to create the impression that the so-called international community stands united behind the West's position in the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. But the reality is different, as we know. But Europe's faith, on the one hand side, the emancipation of the global South, which is evidently, which will be the future. So the Europe's faith, however, will depend on whether it continues to cling to the old Western dominated world order in the wake of US empire, or whether it decides to pursue a self-confident, sovereign, and civilian foreign policy that ensures the primacy of diplomacy and dialogue, and which enters into a cooperative relationship with the countries of the global South on an equal footing. In many European countries, first and foremost in Germany, a fundamental debate is currently underway within the left, which is manifesting itself in the discussions surrounding the delivery of weapons to Ukraine and the support of economic sanctions against Russia. And nothing less is at stake here than the question of whether the European left submits to the Western policy of proxy wars and economic wars and limits itself to cushioning their impacts on the working class without addressing their actual causes, or whether the left, in solidarity with the countries of the global South, engages in fundamental opposition to US imperialism and NATO's policy of confrontation. In Germany, a new peace movement is emerging, which is standing up to the warmongers and campaigning for a peaceful, negotiated solution to the Ukraine war in the interest of its own population as well as the populations of the global South. And with the expansion of military and intelligence support for Ukraine, NATO is willing to accept the risk of direct involvement in this war. Meanwhile, the US is preparing for a war with China. As gratifying as the emancipation of the global South is, we must not forget that the key and existential challenge of the present, in view of the real danger of a military or even nuclear escalation of the new Cold War, is first and foremost shaping the transition to the multipolar world in a peaceful manner. So in this regard, the common task of progressive, of left forces in the West as well as in the South is, in my view, to promote an order based on balancing different interests, diplomacy, and cooperation, as opposed to war and confrontation. This is the precondition for tackling the key challenges facing humanity, such as the establishment for a new just global economic order, nuclear disarmament, and stopping climate change. And I hope this webinar today helps to coordinate these progressive left forces worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Sevim. That was very interesting, very instructive. We hope very much that a new peace movement will emerge in Germany, as you say, but also, of course, across Europe. The next briefing from No Cold War, briefing number 8, is assessing whether Europe can develop an independent foreign policy. Looking very much forward to advancing conversations about that. We're going to move now to Ronnie Kasrils, a legendary fighter in South Africa against apartheid. Ronnie has chronicled this in 3 terrific books, Ronnie, that I highly recommend to everybody about his time fighting against apartheid, particularly Armed and Dangerous. That's Ronnie Kasrils for you. His most recent book is The International Brigade Against Apartheid. I hope, Ronnie, we're going to be able to build an international brigade against the new Cold War. Ronnie Kasrils, please go ahead.
Thanks for such a warm introduction, comrade, compañero Vijay. And yes, I think that's really on the agenda. This international brigade, this international movement, we've seen it in the past at the time of the fight for the Spanish Republic. We've seen it over and over in the struggle for Vietnam and the struggle for anti-colonialism in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on. And I want to immediately say, from a very cold Johannesburg here, with the lights going down somewhat, that I totally associate myself with your opening introduction, with your remarks you've just made, and really to Comrade Sevim there in Berlin. And it's wonderful to hear that articulation from the left in Europe, because what's so troubling is the extent to which so-called leftists are supporting this dreadful proxy war led by the USA and its tool NATO, which is driving the whole planet to a point of enormous peril. In making my presentation, Comrade Vijay has asked me to angle this from the point of view of South Africa and Africa, and why Africa and this country of mine takes such a strong position, refusing to be browbeaten, as is the case in so many of the countries of the global south, from Latin America through Africa to Asia. So I want to get through to that, but I do want to simply say in a couple of sentences that, of course, we need to bear in mind that what is a doctrine followed by the West and articulated by that infamous neocon in 1991, Paul Wolfowitz, called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, was that the USA, with the fall of the Soviet Union, must no longer allow any power in the world to arise, to challenge and compete with the USA. And of course, it's EU support based. And we know what's behind that. That is why we anti-imperialists. That is why we see the dangers of a unipolar world, a world which we feel and we hope and we will work for, and we see it happening. As Comrade Vijay mentioned earlier, there's this tectonic shift, and Sevim, you've made the point as well. And that's why they are fighting tooth and nail to prevent not countries who want to make war with them, but countries who want to develop their economies, to have a protection of their people, their sovereignty, and to have a world which is a multilateral world, not a unipolar world dominated by imperialist USA. So let me come to explain in this short period that I have, why is it that far away from the scene of the theater of that conflict in Ukraine, as happens elsewhere as well, this is a world where I saw a statistic the other day, Vijay, that at present there are 27 wars taking place around the world. And you will find at the root of that the problem of imperialist, colonialist domination. So if I can give you a background that goes back to 1955, very important year for South Africa and internationally. 1955 in South Africa, the Liberation Forces adopted a manifesto called the Freedom Charter, which was about our own liberation from apartheid and internationalism. And in terms of that internationalism was that we wanted a world of peace and coexistence, the points that Sevim has mentioned. So a multilateral world in terms of the founding basis of the United Nations, which of course is about sovereignty and the rights of self-determination, but essential and rooted in that is the respect of others and the security of all people. It's vital to go back to that understanding, by the way, in relation to why Russia, in terms of its existential needs, has carried out the special military operation. But to state that at that particular time, under the police batons and the army guns that charter was adopted, and subsequently the ANC was banned, the Communist Party was already banned. But at that same time, that same year, we had leaders from this country, communists as well as ANC leaders, who were in Bandung at the founding conference of the non-aligned movement. And that's where our position in our Freedom Charter, internationally, in the constitution we have in South Africa, it's based on that non-alignment. And in relation to that, in terms of what we see happening in the Ukraine, we have a non-aligned position, and it's in terms of finding a negotiated settlement and a peaceful settlement, a diplomatic settlement, and not this horror of horrors of NATO, which from 1991, when Wolfowitz preached that doctrine of his, and when Sevim, a former chancellor of Germany, made a promise to Gorbachev, we will not move NATO an inch east, and other leaders were saying the same thing. And of course, why on earth should NATO have continued to exist? The Warsaw Pact packed up at that time. And we've seen the reason why a country like Russia and a Soviet Union that lost 27 million in the Second World War fighting Nazi Germany, and more or less the same alignment from the Baltic to the Black Sea that is now mobilized on the very borders of Russia. That we see that happening again. And history does repeat itself. And this is why the alarm bells are ringing, and why President Ramaphosa and a delegation of African heads of state have been in Kiev and are now this day in Russia and are carrying out discussions. Not that we have a magic wand, but we proceeding from the principles of Bandung, of the non-aligned movement, of what more and more countries of the global south, and including 17, 20 or so now in Africa, will refuse and have refused to sign on to the sanctions program that the USA, the EU, and NATO are pressing forward and saying that they're not interested in any form of peace. It's war all the way, to the point of the peril of a nuclear war. So let me just give you some insight. Why is it then that Africa, and as I speak, I can tell you, and you would see this is an expression of the global south. The people of the global south, the people of Africa, understand what colonialism is. They understand what neo-colonialism is, which in terms of the way the Western colonial countries were defeated and had to concede independence post the Second World War, but have been trying to rein in the control of the countries of the global south. And as you know, we use the term neo-colonialism, and they're countries whose arms are twisted, who are browbeaten, who are blackmailed, who are forced into being subservient, but not all. And we see in relation to the whole of Latin America, to the whole of the global south, the question now is, we will not be browbeaten. We stand by our position. We won't take orders from Uncle Sam. We won't take orders from the EU. Sevim and Vijay and others, I've been around a long time, and I can tell you what's been surprising. I've been very close to government. I've been in government. I still have my links. And the extent to which actually those EU leaders, those former colonial powers, they are outdoing the Yankees in terms of their arrogance and threats. It's actually quite amazing. And we can see this right-wing shift that has taken place in Europe, which is so threatening to the people of Europe, which is why your movement, Sevim and others, are standing firm against the revival of neo-Nazism. This isn't some kind of invention of Putin or the Russians. It's actually taking place, and we see it. So we will not be browbeaten. We stand by the sovereignty of our country and of the global south. We're getting stronger. Vijay has pointed out what's position taken recently in the United Arab Emirates. You know, we can just refer to Honduras. We can refer to Mali. We can refer to Saudi Arabia. The Yankees are panic-stricken. Little Honduras daring to open an embassy in China and vice versa. They cannot stop this. Mali taking its position, out with the French, and for good reason, and so on. Saudi Arabia breaking the dream from Trump and Kushner now to Biden and his other little lackey. They all look alike, these Americans, these young boys out at Madison Square, like Blinken. They look so alike, and they're so arrogant with it. For sure, they are panic-stricken in the way their control is breaking down. So here we are. I'll end on this point, Vijay. It is so important now. Of course, President Ramaphosa and the African group are showing that we are outspoken. We're making points about sanity that must prevail. There's a difference already if you saw the way Zelensky spoke and the way Ramaphosa spoke. And Ramaphosa made a very important point, because Zelensky feels that it's Ukraine who's the victim and Russia must get out totally. But Ramaphosa said that in terms of a peace agreement, the security of all people need to be taken into account. And I'm not going to go on, but just to remind you, what about the security of the Donbass? Why did the EU and so many institutions not come out from 2014 after the US-inspired coup that brought in right-wing and neo-Nazi forces? They never murmured about 13 to 14,000 people who were butchered from 2014 to 2022 in the Donbass. Anyway, good luck to Ramaphosa, and we here, comrades, must be committed to what both Vijay and Sevim had talked about, because we can stop this madness, this rush to nuclear war, to rush to a third world war, a rush into the Cold War, and it's this new non-alignment of the progressive anti-imperialist forces in the world that we must work day and night to ensure that we bring this peace movement to bear, to fruit. It's a tough task, but we've got progressives in every country in the world, from the global north to the global south. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Thank you for these words. But now I want to remind you all that we still have two other speakers at this webinar, and they are Srushana Bodapati and Stephanie Witherby. But first, let's give the floor to Srushana. She is an economist, and she is a research coordinator at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research in India. So, Srushana, thank you so much for joining today. Thank you for being in this activity. And please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Greetings, comrades. People who are very knowledgeable before me have spoken. So I suppose I don't really have much to speak. But I would speak a little about India. The tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine, the thousands or probably hundreds of thousands of deaths that are happening between Ukraine and Russia. So I would say has two lessons for India, because our suspicion is that US wants to use India for the same purpose how it's using Ukraine against Russia in its drive to dismember Russia, in topple its government and use its natural resources without any deaths of its own people and not too much expenditure. And it's using Ukraine at the end of this war, we don't know if Ukraine is going to be there or not. But so this tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine with their complicity of their own governments. So it's a salutary lesson to India and a large section of Indian middle class and Indian intelligentsia, Indian policymakers that have been, like, for past 3 decades, since 1991, when India has liberalized, have been sidling up to US for economic partnership, as well as many of them have been pushing for military partnership as well, even though it hasn't happened so far. But this is a lesson, because US wants to use India exactly in the same way that it's using Ukraine against Russia. US wants to India to militarily confront China at some point, and the fate of what will happen to India if we buy into US's agenda, I think is very clear to us. So in a way, this tragedy unfortunately has been a salutary lesson to us in that way. And the second is the tragedy of Western Europe, and particularly when we see Germany. Such an industrialized and such a developed society. Everybody used to look upon Germany and its industrial development and technology till a couple of years ago. But the fate of Germany, when it is reduced to a vassal state and when its sovereignty, autonomy, everything has been it has come to pass now that it doesn't possess any of it. Even when we were told that Nord Stream, the pipeline is economic lifeline for German industry, and willy-nilly US has just blown it up, and Germany could not even say anything. And so what happens when a military alliance with US is there? That you being a US ally is an oxymoron. Probably there is not much difference. Being an ally brings destruction upon ourselves. So I think these two are lessons that are being, I hope, are being absorbed by Indian policymakers and Indian establishment. And if we come to the new non-alignment movement, so what are the thoughts of Indian policymakers? Is India going to be part of a new non-alignment movement? Is there a thinking towards it? Are questions to examine. But before that, it's interesting to see what are the alignments of India in India right now. There have been great deal of admiration for our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, who was also bureaucrat in the previous governments. So there has been a lot of admiration when he has put down a bureaucrat from EU, whoever it is, when they were questioning India buying oil from Russia. And there was also admiration for him internally and externally when he very strongly said, when he was asked about India being part of a NATO plus with America, when he strongly put that suggestion down, saying that India is not into those constructs. So these are seen positively both outside India and in India, even though he's part of a right-wing government, run by a party that is guided by fascist ideology. So in foreign policy, they're seen as being autonomous and independent. But it is interesting to see if that is the case. So let us, if you look at India's relationship with America, right now, people might feel that, or we also feel that, India is looking at multilateral relationships and maybe distancing itself or starting to question US. But that's just 2 years. Even just 2 years back, Indian capitalists, Indian establishment wanted a very strong relationship with US. In fact, Indian capitalists, especially the big capitalists, have been in partnership with American capital or Western capital since 1991, and that has worked out very well for them. While Indian farmers poor, and it didn't work out well for them, and their status either languished or stagnated while inequalities increased. Indian capitalists have become really, really big. Even when the Iraq, due to that closeness, even when the Iraq war was happening, India was almost on the verge of sending its military to Iraq. But though good sense prevailed, it did not happen. But in 2008, India has passed a nuclear deal, which left has been saying that it would make India a subordinate ally to US. Despite great deal of opposition, despite great deal of risk to the government falling, but because India wanted, the ruling class wanted so strongly a relationship with US, largely economic, but somewhat militarily and defense-wise as well. It pushed through that, doing horse trading and subverting parliamentary processes, and that had happened. But the 2008 crisis has happened in a way that has been again a salutary lesson for India, that 2008 and the crisis and the nuclear deal have come at the right time, when it has come to pass that India cannot hitch its wagons to US for economic development and economic growth. It needs an alternative scenario, though. But to have that alternative economic growth and economic development agenda and strategy, the class structure need to be questioned. Internal impulses for growth need to be changed, but Indian government is not ready for it. Indian establishment and the Indian ruling class is not ready for it. So India has been lurching from, sporadic growth. Our growth numbers are very unreliable. Our statistics are very unreliable. But definitely since 2011 onwards, the misery in India has grown. Employment has been very high for a prolonged time. Small and medium scale industries and everything has been going down. So why I'm talking about this economic scenario, other than the fact that I'm into economics myself, is because India has two alternatives for economic growth and development. Because unlike China, which has taken a decisively leveraged and export-led growth to also improve the conditions of its people, to very decisively grow technologically, India hasn't done so. And the only way Indian establishment feels it can grow is by even today, by hitching its wagons to the US providing its markets, US providing its technology, US giving it various economic accesses, because due to US hegemony. Yes, US hegemony today is being questioned by questioned by China, but still India has, because of the internal, it doesn't want to it doesn't want to reduce these inequalities. It doesn't want to do policies that are going to be helpful for the poor. So its whole economic agenda seems to be externally oriented, depending on on an economic power like US for market and investments and technologies. So that is the predicament of India. Whereas in defense wise, it doesn't want a military alliance. Economically, it feels very strongly that its interests lie with being a partner with America. But being a partner with America is not a one-way street. America is not like USSR. When USSR and India were friends and partners during the non-alignment time, USSR was an all-weather friend. It provided technology, economic assistance, and multilateral assistance, military support in many ways that and without expecting that much any exploitative conditions return. But that is not going to be the case with America. America expects that India is going to be a military partner, and go on be supportive of military adventures of US, because India is a huge amount of people and huge amount of soldiers, and militarily a strong power itself, if not as strong as many others, but it's still strong power. So US wants India to draw into that military alliance with itself. Despite our external affairs ministers and everybody saying we have been part of Quad, and despite India's unwillingness to be part of a military alliance, especially in considering the fact that India is a neighbor to China and it doesn't want to go on a destructive war with China, which is going to be detrimental for us as well. India doesn't want to be part of that military alliance. But it has been taking baby steps towards it. As being part of Quad, even while dragging its feet, it has been signing up various agreements slowly. So my fear in the left is that this, despite intention of India, because it wants it looks up to US for an economic as a model for its economic growth, wants a partnership with it. At some point, India might slowly, even without it realizing, might get dragged into a closer military partnership, which is going to be devastating for India when it if anything if US decides to, or US at some point will light the fire of a war in the Asian continent. So this is the predicament of India, and the only way that India can get out of it is the multilateral engagement. Even though India is part of BRICS, SEO, and other multilateral engagements, because it is exclusively looking at US for its economic growth, and not so much, even though it is hedging its bets with other countries, being part of BRICS and doing some currency arrangements, etc. Still, internally, that has not taken such a front seat in Indian policy making. But hopefully in next coming years, India sees and better sense prevails, and India, being a large country outside Russia, China, and US, will take leadership, will have a proper strategy and proper vision for a multilateral non-aligned movement, as well as such relationships. Thank you.
Bien, muchas gracias, Srujana.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Srujana. We will now give the floor to our last speaker, the last speaker of this international seminar of the new non-alignment and new Cold War. And then we will go into a few minutes for question and answers, discussion, if we have time for this. So now we will continue with Stephanie Weatherby. She is part of the Secretariat of the International People's Assembly. She is at the Brazil headquarters. And if you don't know what this is about, the IPA is an internationalist process that seeks to construct anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and ecology and feminism at an international level. And today it is made up of more than 200 organizations. Stephanie, it is a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you very much for participating in this activity. And go ahead, please. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Gisela for this invitation, and also I'd like to thank Vijay. To us, from the International People's Assembly, This discussion is very important because one of the principles and fundamental topics or themes within the IPA is to confront American imperialism. In this sense, non-alignment today and the new geopolitical context that is being configured is highly important. And I would like to talk about the perspective from Latin America. And I would also like to talk about the opportunities that are opening up as progressive left popular organizations in this context of non-alignment. To start, I would like to say that our understanding of non-alignment is not reduced to foreign policy adopted by different countries. There is a very important focus on the fact that as soon as different international powers adopt non-support of war or non-support of sanctions, non-alignment is reduced to these type of positionings and actions. What I wanted to mention and talk about today, first of all, is that non-alignment also has to do with domestic policy in countries. National policy. One of the characteristics of unipolarity and American hegemony insists upon for the rest of the world, and particularly for peripheral economies, is that their goal, their objective, their national interest, economic development interest, subserves the American economic interests. So when a country and a national economy chooses to prioritize their own economic development, domestic process and national process, that also configures a non-aligned policy. It also contributes to a non-aligned policy. I believe this is very important because part of what attacks us so much within the field of unipolarity that we suffer so much in Latin America is that when they subject our economic policy and development policy to American hegemony, we suffer all the effects that we have been living in the last years: deindustrialization, increase of inequality, and a series of social problems that, of course, we know very well. Now, the non-aligned field that is being configured around the world is very heterogeneous. That's important to say. It's very different in different parts of the world. We have some countries that we can highlight. They are protagonists in this new non-alignment: Turkey, India, South Africa, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and several others. And among those, we also have several other Latin American countries that, even when they are not considered as the main countries in this new non-aligned field because they do not have such a large economy, but they are also important. Within this field that I mentioned, part of what it is important to highlight is that there is not an ideological affinity among them. There are many different ideological differences between these countries and their governments. But what they do have in common is that they look for autonomy. They are affirming autonomy to for the in the interest of their national governments and their projects. Even when they are different from one country to the other, they have a certain unity in the sense that they are looking to affirm autonomy. And I believe that it's very important to highlight that there is a very interesting phenomenon that is being configured in the rise of this new non-alignment. It is that the more this field grows of non-aligned, the more countries that join this position of not aligning with the powers like the US or Europe, more power they are able to harness individually and more they are able to gain because as the non-aligned field grows, their positions are a larger threat to US hegemony. And it is more important for the US to destroy or disarm this non-aligned field. So in spite of the fact that there is no ideological affinity or homogeneity in this non-aligned field, the fact that it is growing gives it a relative power and also gives it a relative capacity to affirm this autonomy that they are searching for or striving for. Another thing that I wanted to highlight, that it was also mentioned by Ronnie, and I think it's very important, is that one thing that gives unity to this field of the non-aligned is the fact of having lived colonialism and having been through colonialism and imperialism. The fact that they have experienced in their very recent history imperialism and colonialism gives them a relative convergence. There is a common experience among these different countries, and I believe that this is very important. In Latin America, I think that there is more unity, there is more convergence, there are more similarities within this field of non-aligned, because there is a common history of having lived American imperialism in very similar ways in the different countries of the region, and also because within the last period, several decades, there were very important processes that seeked to construct regional unity that enabled a dialogue among the different countries and tried to construct a greater unity between the different countries of the regions. I want to highlight now the experience of Brazil and Mexico. And I want to say that one of the things that characterize this non-aligned posture or stance of these two countries is the fact that the governments that are currently there in Mexico with López Obrador and Lula in Brazil want to give prominence to the national economic development in order to eliminate inequalities. This is a priority for both governments, and it is a first and foremost priority, and it is put in the first place facing imperialist policies that the United States seeks to implement in the region. However, Brazil and Mexico are standing in very different places. And this is something that we always have to remember. On the one hand, we have Brazil, that as his main commercial partners are in the first place China, with 32%, approximately one third of their export and import economic activity has to do with the relationship with China, and then 10% with the United States. So it has a very important relationship with China. With the US, it is still a very important relationship, but not as much as it is with China today. It is a relationship that is growing and is broadening. Now, Mexico has a very different situation, and there's a saying that we say as Mexicans, and we say "poor Mexico, so far away from God and so close to the U.S." It's an expression because we experience all the effects of being in the border, of having the border with this country, with this huge imperialist power that characterizes and dominates the unipolarity that we are just starting to overcome. Mexico's main economic trade partner is the US, of course, and it is over 50% of Mexico's economic relationship. It depends on this relationship with the US. Sorry, 50% of Mexico's economy in trade. So something that is not so well known by people outside the region, and it's very important to mention, is that during the last period, the last 15 years, and from what has been in relation to a war against drugs in Mexico, but it's not only against drugs, it's also against social organizations and the peoples. The Mexican territory has been militarizing, and this has also entailed active participation from the US. So even when Mexico is increasingly seeking to affirm autonomy in order to pursue its own national interests, still it has a very dependent relationship with the US. It is very dependent on US control, and it's trying to overcome. And I believe that all the positions that Andrés Manuel López Obrador is trying to adopt have to be seen understanding all the limitations that Mexico is facing merely because of its geography. But I do believe that both Mexico and Brazil and other countries in the regions, just like it has been mentioned, have been presenting autonomy positions, particularly in relation to the war in Ukraine. In Brazil, they have proposed paths towards peace. They have positioned against the conflict in Ukraine. And in Mexico, they have established a position of lamenting weapons to the sending of weapons to Ukraine. We understand, and Mexico understands, that the more weapons are fed into Ukraine, this is going to perpetuate war, and it is a way of not looking for peace, of course. And both countries, particularly Mexico, have presented a position of not supporting sanctions against Russia as well. So it's very important to say and to pay attention to the fact that when Mexico last year, particularly in September, where López Obrador is presenting this position of towards peace, presenting a position saying that we're not going to respect sanctions against Russia because we don't feel that they correspond to our interests and we don't think that they are fair. After that moment, in the intelligentsia community in the US, there is increasing debate, increasing criticism towards Mexican democratic process. As soon as Mexico starts to state an increasingly autonomous position in terms of its foreign policy, the government of Andrés Manuel is being increasingly criticized by the US, and this debate within the intelligentsia community in the US begins where they start saying that Mexico is turning into a dictatorship, that Andrés Manuel has authoritarian characteristics, that democracy in Mexico is in risk. It is a parallel process. And for Latin America, this is very well known. We have a lived experience there over decades. As soon as a country starts to adopt positions in national policy or in foreign policy that do not favor the United States, they begin to criticize us for being undemocratic, for not respecting certain liberal economy, etc., etc. So I think that something that hasn't been mentioned enough here, and that it's important to mention, it's very important to mention, because the US here in this position of wanting to broaden, in terms of broadening the non-alignment position, I think that it's very important to discuss in this space and in all the spaces is contradictions within the US that have also fostered the creation of this non-alignment field, the internal contradictions in the US. We don't have a lot of time here to go into this, but I want to highlight two things. First of all, the US, since the election of Trump, of course from before, but at least since the election of Trump and up to now, it has a very polarized internal political environment. And this has fostered, in a way, because this has taken away capacity to collaborate and articulate at the international level, particularly in relation to one element. The United States is now facing a huge challenge of balancing the demands of a more protectionist economic policy so as to protect its own industry and its own economic agents facing China, and the demands of adopting a more globalized policy that can enable it in a way to reconstruct relationships with the countries that it wants to influence more. So on the one hand, the US has to correspond to the protectionist demands of their national political agents, and on the other hand, if they want to earn the support again of several powers that today are in the non-aligned field, they have to offer something in economic terms. They have to offer something in terms of economic development for those countries that are looking for an agenda of their own. And they can't do both things at the same time. Either they adopt a protectionist agenda or they adopt a globalized agenda. And this dilemma is caused by the polarization that it's living internally as well. This difficulty in the US, this difficulty, this push or pull between these two different agendas, we saw it last year when they signed the CHIPS agreement, and I believe that there is and certain discontent among the trade partners of the US. And I believe that this situation that the US is living right now, it is important that we analyze them and we understand them better, because they offer opportunities to grow the non-aligned field, or at least to find more affinity in terms of a multipolar project. I wanted to say that in the case of Latin America, something that is very important today is that we need to harness autonomy that we are living today in this political context in order to strengthen sovereignty and democracy in our regions. I think it's very important to create unity at the regional level to defend Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Peru, because in spite of everything that can be said about any of these processes, it is undeniable that these processes have to be defended by the principle of national sovereignty of our governments. And one of the things that have been very difficult for us in the last period has to do with convincing our own bourgeoisie that defending national democracy, that defending national sovereignty is in the interest of a national economic development program, and that putting ourselves against these different governments is a plan that only weakens us politically and economically. I wanted to close
So I want to close by saying
that
today the conversation about Ukraine
the US is saying that
the threat to the
saying
world
it
peace
wants
is
to
Russia
say that
and then
Russia is
China.
the main threat to
And
world
we have
peace
to
in the first place, and then
remember
China. But we need to remember who constitutes the highest threat to world peace, and it is the US and the unipolarity under US hegemony. It is not Russia, it is not China, and I believe that
tenemos que avanzar hacia una política multipolar que realmente promueva la paz, pero una paz que esté fundamentada y basada
but a peace that's based on national sovereignty and the development in our countries so that we fight inequality. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Stephanie. Gracias por nuestro comentario.
Thank you for the comment.
Gisela, there's no need to be so surprised. This has been a remarkable set of commentaries. Yesterday, one of our great friends of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the No Cold War platform, Daniel Ellsberg, died. Daniel was 92 years old, a fighter for peace and justice till the very end. Many people know Daniel as the man who was a consultant for the Rand Corporation, who, at great cost to himself, great bravery, Xeroxed a massive study done by the US government about its war on Vietnam. He was able to publish that text, later known as the Pentagon Papers. What's less known is Daniel was a great fighter against the doomsday machine, the massive nuclear enterprise in the United States. And in fact, he had photocopied documents about the US nuclear program, which he was cautioned at the time not to release because that would have been for him a death sentence immediately. But he did speak about those documents right through his life. A very brave man, our friend Daniel Ellsberg. We will not forget you. Of course, as we say these things about Daniel Ellsberg, it's important to point out that Daniel Ellsberg was the whistleblower of the Cold War era. Right now, the whistleblower of the no Cold War era is sitting in Belmarsh prison, likely to be extradited to the United States. And that, of course, is Julian Assange, who set up the WikiLeaks project to reveal state secrets through whistleblowers. Julian Assange, another friend of our process, somebody whose incarceration by the British government and possible extradition we fundamentally oppose. Truth tellers like Julian, not to be heard, to be silenced. In fact, I want to just say that the truth tellers today, Sevim, Ronnie, Srujana, Stephanie, the truth tellers today need to have their voices heard much more loudly by many, many more millions and millions of people, billions of people, in fact. It's interesting that the mainstream press, whether it's in the European sector or it's in the United States and so on, they talk a lot about freedom of expression, but they don't speak up on behalf of Julian Assange, who revealed the crimes conducted by the United States and its allies against Afghanistan and against Iraq and other countries in the world. Nor do they, of course, give a place for people like Sevim, Ronnie, Srujana, and Stephanie to put forward this kind of sophisticated analysis, which is driven from a place of love for humanity, not the desire to dominate the world. I'm really happy that you joined us today for our webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Gisela, who's going to talk a little bit more about our statement. Sevim is one of the main signatories of our statement. I'll let Gisela talk about that, and then we'll wrap up this webinar.
Bueno, gracias, Vijay. Bueno,
Thank you, Vijay. As I said in the beginning of the webinar and during this activity,
tan cambiante, donde
in este mundo, in this world, in this context, where they have all these forces stronger, and they're trying to advance and break the unity of our peoples. What we want with our campaign is that we need to strengthen the cooperation. Tenemos que go against the Western increase of using arms, nuclear arms, and we have to focus on multilateralism with all the peoples, especially with the global south. That's why I invite you again to go to our website to read our statement, to sign our statement, and invite you to be part of this movement, these activities against the Cold War, and stay in participate as you can to promote peace, dialogue, and cooperation that are needed for us to overcome the challenges of humanity that we have with more exclusion and inequality. So again, nocoldwar.org. Sign up and sign the statement. I'd like to thank all that participated in this event. Thank you very much to the speakers, to all the organizations that co-organized this activity. And we are the No Cold War campaign, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, Pan-Africanism Today, Alpha Movements, and the IPA. Thank you very much again for those who joined in this debate. And let's have more debates as we're going to have in the future. Thank you.